Harlem had a way of hiding its fear behind music. On most nights, the sound of a trumpet could convince you that everything was alive and well, that the world outside didn't press so hard against the doors and windows. But on this particular night, even the music felt cautious, like it knew something the people hadn't fully said out loud yet. Conversations lowered when unfamiliar shoes stepped onto familiar sidewalks. Eyes followed movements they would usually ignore. And beneath it all, there was a quiet understanding moving through the streets like a shadow something was coming. Ellsworth. Bumpy Johnson did not believe in reacting to shadows. He believed in understanding them. He sat in a dim back room, where the air smelled faintly of tobacco and time, the kind of place where men spoke carefully because words, once released, could travel farther than intended. A young man stood across from him, his voice unsteady as he described what had happened just hours earlier. A small grocery owner, a man known for giving children extra fruit when their parents couldn't afford it, had been cornered by outsiders. Not robbed, not attacked, something quieter, something colder. They had smiled while explaining to him that his success was now dependent on their approval. Bumpy listened without interruption. His stillness wasn't passive, it was deliberate. It forced the room to slow down, to respect the weight of what was being said. When the young man finished, expecting instructions or anger, Bumpy simply asked, "Did he look afraid or ashamed?" The question caught everyone off guard. Both, the young man admitted. Bumpy nodded slightly, as if confirming something he already understood. "Fear passes," he said quietly. "Shame stays. And shame spreads faster than anything else." His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room in a way noise never could. If they're bringing shame into Harlem, they're not here for money, they're here for control. The room grew colder, though no one moved, because control meant something deeper than business. It meant rewriting how people saw themselves. And that was something Bumpy would never allow. Across the city, in a place far removed from Harlem's rhythm, Dutch Schultz sat surrounded by men who believed power was something you displayed, something you imposed. The room he occupied was filled with confidence that bordered on arrogance, the kind that comes from never being challenged in a meaningful way. Dutch wasn't interested in Harlem's culture, its resilience, or its history. He saw it as an opportunity. A place that had been overlooked long enough to be taken without resistance, or so he believed. But Dutch made one mistake. He thought silence meant weakness. Back in Harlem, Bumpy moved through the streets not as a ruler, but as a presence. He stopped at corners, spoke to shopkeepers, acknowledged elders, listened more than he spoke. And everywhere he went, people felt something shift, not dramatically, not instantly, but enough to notice. He wasn't gathering followers. He was reminding people of something they had almost forgotten, that dignity was not something given. It was something held. Late that night, as the city quieted just enough to hear its own thoughts, a car rolled slowly through a Harlem street, its presence deliberate. It stopped outside a small cafe owned by a man who had never caused trouble, never asked for more than his share. Two men stepped out, their movements calm, almost polite. They entered the cafe, spoke briefly, and left just as quietly. No shouting, no breaking glass, but when they left, the cafe owner stood frozen behind his counter, his hands resting on wood that suddenly didn't feel like his anymore. By morning, the story had spread not loudly, but completely, and Harlem understood. Wasn't an attack. It was a message. Bumpy heard it the same way everyone else did, but he understood it differently. Where others saw intimidation, he saw a test. Not of strength, but of response. Whoever was behind this wanted reaction. They wanted fear to rise, voices to get louder, mistakes to be made. Bumpy chose something else. That afternoon, he visited the cafe. He didn't make a scene. He didn't question the owner in front of others. He simply ordered a cup of coffee and sat down like any other customer. The owner's hands trembled slightly as he served it, Bumpy noticed, but he didn't mention it. Instead, he took a slow sip, placed the cup down gently and said, "This place still yours?" The owner hesitated. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wasn't sure if the answer still felt true. Double quotes. "Yes," he said finally, though it sounded uncertain. Bumpy nodded once. "Then don't let anyone make you say that." Like a question. It was a simple sentence, but it did something unexpected. The owner straightened, just slightly. That was how Bumpy worked. Not by overpowering situations, but by restoring something that had been quietly taken. That evening, word reached Dutch Schultz. He listened as one of his men explained that there had been no resistance, no retaliation, just calm. The kind of calm that didn't make sense. Dutch frowned, not because he was threatened, but because he was confused. "So he did nothing?" he asked. The man hesitated. "Not exactly." Dutch leaned forward. "Then what did he do?" The answer came. Slowly, he made it feel like nothing changed. And that was the first moment Dutch Schultz realized something wasn't right. Because power relies on change, on disruption, on visible impact. If nothing appeared to change, then power had nowhere to land. Back in Harlem, the night deepened again, but this time, something was different. The fear was still there, but it wasn't alone. It had been met with something else. Something quieter, something steadier. Something far more dangerous to anyone who believed control came from intimidation. Bumpy Johnson stood on a corner, hands in his coat pockets, watching the street with the same calm expression he always carried. A young boy passed by, glanced at him, and nodded, not out of fear, but respect. Bumpy nodded back, and in that small exchange, Harlem began to remember itself. But the night wasn't finished, because somewhere beyond the reach of Harlem's streetlights, decisions were being made, decisions that would test not just one man, but an entire community. And when those decisions arrived, they wouldn't come with warning, they would come with pressure. With consequences, with moments that demanded more than calm. And for the first time, even those who believed in Bumpy began to wonder, could silence really stand against something that loud? Bumpy, however, did not wonder. Because he understood something most people didn't. Single quotes. Silence, when carried with purpose, is not the absence of power. It is the beginning of it. The strongest storms don't announce themselves, they arrive when the world thinks it's still quiet. The silence that Bumpy Johnson had chosen did not weaken the storm, it sharpened it. Harlem felt it in ways that couldn't be measured, only sensed. The air itself seemed heavier, as if every street corner was holding its breath, waiting for something unseen to make the first undeniable move. And when that move finally came, it did not arrive loudly. It arrived carefully, deliberately. And it made sure it hurt. It began with someone no one expected. A schoolteacher named Mr. Elijah Carter, an older man. Soft-spoken, respected. The kind of person who greeted everyone by name and never raised his voice, even when the world gave him reasons to. Was stopped on his way home one evening. Not by criminals in the usual sense, not by chaos or desperation, but by men who carried themselves with controlled intent. They didn't strike him, they didn't shout. They simply delayed him, questioned him, took his time and twisted it into something that felt like ownership. They left him standing on the sidewalk long after the conversation had ended, his dignity shaken in a way that left no visible mark, but a lasting weight. And that was the point. By morning, Harlem didn't just feel watched, it felt tested. This time the message was clearer. If we can touch your strongest, your most respected, your most peaceful, then no one is beyond reach. When the story reached Bumpy, he didn't respond immediately. Not outwardly. He sat in the same dim room, the same steady posture. But something in his stillness had changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough for those who knew him to feel it. This wasn't just pressure anymore, it was strategy. It was calculated. And more importantly, it was personal. Why him? One of the younger men asked, frustration barely contained. Out of everyone, why him? Bumpy didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted toward the window, toward the street where life continued as if nothing had shifted. Then he spoke quietly, but with clarity that cut deeper than anger ever. Could, because if they can make a good man feel small, they can make anyone feel replaceable. The room fell silent, because everyone understood. This wasn't about control over business anymore. This was about control over identity. And that was something Bumpy would not allow to be rewritten. But even then, he didn't rush. He didn't gather men or raise voices or escalate tension. Instead, he did something that confused everyone watching, including those who thought they were one step ahead of him. He went to see Mr. Carter. Not with a crowd, not with protection, just himself. He found the teacher sitting quietly in his home, hands folded, eyes distant, not broken, but searching for something that had been shaken loose. When Bumpy entered, there was no dramatic exchange, no immediate reassurance. He simply sat down across from him, as if they were two men sharing an ordinary afternoon. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. And then Bumpy asked gently, "Did they take anything from you?" Mr. Carter hesitated. Then he answered, "No." Bumpy nodded once. "Good." Another pause, and then Bumpy leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but carrying something deeper, something unshakable. "Then don't give them anything either." The words settled into the room, quiet but powerful, and slowly. Mr. Carter's posture changed, not dramatically, not instantly, but enough. Enough for something to begin returning. That was Bumpy's way. He didn't rebuild people with force. He reminded them they were never truly broken. But while Harlem began to steady itself, Dutch Schultz grew increasingly unsettled. Reports kept coming in, and none of them made sense. There were no retaliations, no open conflicts, no obvious resistance, yet his influence wasn't expanding the way it should have. The pressure he applied wasn't creating submission. It was creating something else, something quieter, something harder to control, and that frustrated him. Because Dutch understood power as something visible, something that bent others, something that produced immediate results. But Bumpy's approach, it didn't follow those rules. It absorbed pressure. It redirected it. It made it ineffective. And that was something Dutch had never dealt with before. So he decided to change the approach. If Harlem wouldn't react to fear, then it would react to loss. The next move came swiftly, but again, without spectacle. A small business one that had quietly supported the community for years suddenly found itself unable to operate. Supplies delayed, permissions questioned, doors effectively closed without a single law being clearly broken. It wasn't destruction. It was suffocation. And this time, the message was undeniable. We can take away what matters without touching it. Harlem felt it immediately, because this wasn't about intimidation anymore. This was about survival. People began to worry, not loudly, not openly, but deeply. The kind of worry that sits in your chest and doesn't leave. The kind that makes you question whether standing firm is worth the cost. And for the first time, some began to doubt. Not Bumpy himself, but the idea that Kung could win against something this calculated. Bumpy saw it. He saw it in the way conversations changed, in the way eyes lingered a little longer, in the way hope started to hesitate. And that's when he knew the real battle had arrived. Not in the streets, not in back rooms, but in the minds of the people. That night, Bumpy walked through Harlem alone, no destination. No urgency, just presence. He passed by the closed shop, its windows dark, its absence louder than any noise could be. He stopped for a moment, looking at it, not with anger, not with frustration, but with understanding. Then he did something no one expected. The next morning, he returned. And he opened the door, Not as an owner, not as a replacement, but as a man refusing to let something be erased. Word spread quickly, not as panic, but as curiosity. People gathered, not because they were told to, but because they needed to see it for themselves. Inside, Bumpy stood calmly, arranging items, restoring order, bringing life back into a place that had been quietly taken. Someone finally asked, "What are you doing?" Bumpy didn't look up immediately. He continued what he was doing, steady, precise. Then he answered, reminding them, "This place doesn't forget who it belongs to. No threats, no confrontation, just action." And in that moment, something shifted again. Because Dutch Schultz had expected fear. He had expected retreat. He had expected submission, but what he got instead was resistance without violence, defiance without chaos, strength without noise. And for the first time, he felt it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to recognize it. This wasn't going to be easy, because Bumpy Johnson wasn't just protecting Harlem, he was teaching it how to stand. And once people learn how to stand, they don't fall the same way again. True power isn't forcing others down. It's making sure they never forget how to rise. Harlem no longer felt like it was waiting. It felt like it was being watched while it decided what it would become. The pressure had moved past fear, past uncertainty, and into something far more dangerous, quiet defiance. Not loud enough to provoke immediate retaliation, but strong enough to disrupt control. And that kind of defiance had a way of unsettling men who believed power should always be obvious. Dutch Schultz had begun to notice something he couldn't explain. His influence was present, but it wasn't spreading. His presence was known, but it wasn't respected. And most importantly, his pressure was being absorbed in a way that left no clear enemy to confront. That made him restless. Because a man like Dutch did not fear opposition. He feared irrelevance. And Harlem, under Bumpy Johnson's steady hand, was slowly making him feel exactly that. So this time, Dutch didn't send a message, he sent a moment. It happened on a late afternoon when the streets were alive with ordinary life children. Running, vendors calling out, conversations blending into a familiar rhythm that felt almost safe again. That illusion lasted just long enough to make what followed more impactful. A black sedan rolled into the heart of Harlem and stopped in a place where it didn't belong. Not because of its color or its shine, but because of its intention. Men stepped out, not aggressive, not loud, but unmistakably deliberate. They walked into the center of the street and simply stood there, interrupting the natural flow of life without saying a word. Their presence alone was enough to shift the energy of the entire block. People slowed down, voices lowered, eyes turned away. It was not chaos, it was control. And then one of the men did something small but precise. He picked up a wooden crate from a nearby vendor's stand, examined it briefly, and placed it back down. Slightly out of place, nothing broken, nothing stolen. Just changed, and somehow that made it worse. Because the message wasn't about damage, it was about authority. We can move things. We can rearrange your world, and you will watch it happen. The men left just as quietly as they arrived. But the street didn't return to normal. Because something invisible had been disturbed, and everyone felt it. By evening, the story had reached every corner of Harlem. And this time, the reaction was different. There was no confusion, no uncertainty. Just a growing realization that this wasn't about isolated incidents anymore. This was a demonstration. A calculated effort to show that control didn't need violence to exist. It only needed presence. Bumpy Johnson understood immediately. He didn't need to hear every detail. He didn't need confirmation. Because he recognized the strategy. This wasn't an attack on businesses. This wasn't pressure on individuals. This was something deeper. This was psychological. A slow attempt to make Harlem feel like it was no longer its own. That night, Bumpy didn't sit in the back room. He didn't wait for reports. He walked. Through every street that had felt the shift. Through every corner where silence had replaced conversation. Through every space where people had started to question something they once knew without thinking. Does this still belong to us? He didn't speak at first. He didn't gather a crowd. He simply existed within those spaces, calm, unshaken, present, and slowly. People began to notice, not because he demanded attention, but because his presence felt like the answer to a question no one had fully asked. By the time he reached the street where the crate had been moved, a small group had formed, not intentionally, not organized, just drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. Bumpy stopped, looked at the crate, and for a long moment, did nothing. The crowd waited, not for action, but for meaning. Then Bumpy stepped forward, picked up the crate, and placed it back exactly where it had been. No speech, no explanation. Just restoration. And then he turned to the vendor, met his eyes, and said quietly, "Keep it where it belongs." That was all. But it was enough. Because in that moment, something powerful happened. The message Dutch had sent was answered, not with force, not with retaliation, but with clarity. You can move things, but you don't decide where they stay. The crowd didn't cheer. There was no applause. Just a shift. A subtle but undeniable shift. Shoulders straightened. Eyes lifted. Conversations returned, not louder, but stronger. And for the first time since the pressure began, Harlem didn't feel watched. It felt awake. But across the city, Dutch Schultz received the report, and this time, he didn't dismiss it. He listened carefully. Because something about it unsettled him, not the act itself, but what it represented. Bumpy Johnson had responded without confrontation, without escalation, without fear. And somehow, that made the response more powerful than any reaction Dutch could have predicted, because it didn't challenge him directly. It made him unnecessary. Dutch leaned back in his chair, his usual confidence dimmed just enough to reveal something else beneath it, concern. Because power, when it stops being acknowledged, starts to fade. And Bumpy Johnson was doing exactly that, not by destroying it, but by ignoring its authority. And that was something Dutch couldn't control. Back in Harlem, the night settled differently, not lighter. Not easier, but steadier. The fear hadn't disappeared. The pressure hadn't ended. But something had changed in how it was carried. It no longer bent people. It no longer defined them. It had been met. Not with noise, but with certainty. And that certainty spread quietly, just like the fear once had, only this time. It didn't weaken anything. It strengthened everything. Bumpy stood once more at the edge of the street, watching life return, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. A young boy ran past him, laughing. A vendor called out again. A door reopened. Small things, but real, and in those small things was victory. Not final, not absolute, but undeniable, because the battle had never been about overpowering Dutch Schultz. It had been about something far more important, making sure Harlem never forgot who it was. And now, it remembered. But the story wasn't over, because men like Dutch didn't accept being made irrelevant. They reacted. And when they did, it wouldn't be subtle anymore. It would be direct, and it would test everything Bumpy had built. But Bumpy didn't move, didn't prepare in ways others expected, because he already understood something they didn't. The strongest foundations don't shake when pressure increases. They prove why they were built that way. Power fades when people stop believing in it, but respect only grows when it's remembered. By the time the final phase arrived, Harlem no longer looked like a place under pressure. It looked like a place being tested from every direction at once. The quiet tactics had failed to break it. The subtle demonstrations had failed to control it. And the psychological weight that was meant to bend it had instead done something unexpected. It had sharpened it. And that was the moment when men, like Dutch Schultz, made their most dangerous decision. They stopped being patient. The shift was immediate, but not chaotic. It was calculated in a different way, now more direct, more visible, designed not just to influence, but to overwhelm. Businesses that had quietly stood their ground began to face coordinated obstacles all at once. Deliveries delayed across multiple blocks, inspections appearing without warning. Conversations that used to end with tension now ended with silence that felt like a threat. It was no longer a suggestion. It was pressure, fully applied, and Harlem felt it. Not in panic, but in weight. Because this time, the cost of standing firm was no longer theoretical. It was real. It showed up in empty shelves, in worried glances, in conversations that paused before reaching their natural end. People weren't breaking, but they were beginning to ask a question they hadn't asked before. How long can this last? And for the first time, even the strongest among them felt the strain. Bumpy Johnson saw it all. He didn't need reports anymore. He saw it in the rhythm of the streets, in the way footsteps slowed just slightly, in the way voices lowered just a fraction. Too much. The unity was still there, but it was being tested in a way that required more than quiet strength. It required something final, but Bumpy did not rush toward confrontation. He moved toward understanding. That night, he didn't walk through Harlem like before. He walked through it with purpose. He stopped at every place that had been affected, not to fix it, not to promise anything, but to acknowledge it. He looked people in the eye, not as a leader addressing followers, but as a man standing beside other people who were carrying something heavy. And everywhere he went, he said very little, because he knew something most didn't. Words, at a time like this, could either strengthen resolve or expose doubt, so he chose them carefully. At one shop, where the owner stood behind a half-empty counter, Bumpy simply said, "You're still here." The man nodded, unsure what that meant. Bumpy met his eyes. That's what matters. And then he left. At another corner, where two men argued quietly about whether continuing was worth it, Bumpy stepped between them, not to stop them, but to redirect them. "You don't decide under pressure," he said calmly. "You decide before it. And then you stand on it. No speeches, no commands, just clarity." And slowly, something began to shift again, not in the streets, but inside the people. Because Bumpy wasn't trying to remove the pressure. He was teaching them how to carry it. But across the city, Dutch Schultz had reached his conclusion. This wasn't about territory anymore. This was about control that had slipped. And control, once lost, demanded something stronger to reclaim it. So Dutch made his final move, not subtle, not indirect. A message was sent, not through intermediaries, not through quiet actions, but through presence. A meeting, not a request. A demand, and this time it wasn't in a private room. It was in a place that could be seen. A place that would make the outcome visible. When Bumpy received the message, he read it once, then folded it. No reaction, no visible thought. Just acceptance. Because he understood something clearly now. This wasn't about negotiation. This was about definition. The day of the meeting arrived with a tension that could be felt without being spoken. Harlem moved slower, not out of fear, but out of awareness. People didn't gather openly, but they watched, from windows, from doorways, from corners where presence could remain unnoticed, because everyone understood whatever happened next would decide something bigger than one man. When Bumpy arrived, he did not arrive with an entourage. He did not arrive with protection. He arrived alone. And that alone said everything. Dutch Schultz was already there, surrounded by men who believed their presence alone created authority. The space between them wasn't large, but it felt like distance measured in something deeper than steps. Dutch spoke first. Not loudly, but with the weight of someone who expected to be heard. "You've made this harder than it needed to." He said, his tone controlled but edged with frustration. Bumpy didn't respond immediately. He let the words settle. Then he stepped forward, just enough to close the distance slightly, not aggressively, not defensively, just evenly. "Easy isn't always right," he said calmly. Dutch exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. "This ends one way," he said. "You step aside, or things change." There it was, clear, direct, final, and for a moment, silence filled the space. Not empty silence, heavy silence. The kind that carries decision. Bumpy looked around, not at the men, not at the setup, but at the space itself, at what it represented, at what it had become. And then he spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that didn't need volume. "Things already changed." Dutch's expression tightened. Bumpy continued, "You just didn't notice." And in that moment, something shifted. Because Dutch realized this wasn't a man resisting control. This was a man who had already removed its influence. The power Dutch believed he had no longer applied. Not here, not anymore. There was no escalation, no dramatic outcome. Because there didn't need to be. The decision had already been made, not in that moment, but in every moment leading up to it. Dutch didn't respond immediately, because for the first time, he had nothing to say that would change what had already happened, and slowly, without announcement, without conclusion, the meeting ended. Not with victory, not with defeat, but with understanding. Back in Harlem, the shift was felt almost instantly. Not because anything visible had changed, but because something internal had settled. The pressure didn't disappear overnight. The challenges didn't vanish, but the question was gone. Who does this belong to? It had been answered. Not through force, not through dominance, but through presence, through consistency, through a man who never raised his voice, but never lowered his standards. Years later, when Bumpy Johnson's time came to an end, the streets of Harlem didn't fill with fear. They filled with people, thousands of them. Not because they were called, but because they remembered. They remembered the man who didn't fight for control, but for dignity. Who didn't demand respect, but lived in a way that made it inevitable. Who didn't leave behind loud words, but left behind something far more powerful, a standard. And that was his final message, not spoken at the end, but proven over time, because in the end, Bumpy Johnson didn't win by overpowering his enemies. He won by outlasting their idea of power itself, and that kind of victory doesn't fade. It becomes legacy. Real power doesn't force the world to listen. It becomes something the world can never ignore.